Okay, so we are officially starting a new book, and as we've gone through many times, we're really jumping all over the place. We started in Genesis, then went to Revelation, then went to Romans, and then we just finished the book of John. And I think if you're doing this as a Bible study, that doesn't make a ton of sense. We're all over the place, but with our goal of conducting this more of a how do we study the Bible and facilitating your own development. I think the reason we're doing it the way we're doing it is because we want to talk about how, yes, this is a one cohesive book. It's 66 separate writings that are compiled into a single book. It is a unified and integrated message system, but there are different ways to study each one. There are different purposes. There's a reason the Holy Spirit didn't just write out a single book in a set of instructions from point one to the end. It's meant to have different segments. It's meant to be presented in different styles, each one of the styles having a different purpose. And so we're kind of taking a sampling of each and getting into the prophets is a really interesting study, not just because if you've studied the prophets at all, or if you've gotten into Bible study, you've probably gotten into Daniel. It is entertaining. It's easy to read. It's easy to get something out of it, even if you're not doing a deep dive. But I think we're obviously going to try to go past that level and go for something deeper. But also, it really forms the foundation for what is it we believe and how do we justify the faith that we have in this weird spiritual thing that we're all gathered and have in common. What gives you the confidence to say this is truth? It doesn't establish what truth is, right? That's what we've been studying. It's not saying there's nothing in Daniel that's going to form the basis of your theology. But if you're asking the question, why do I have confidence? I think one of the things you have to do is go back and start at the prophets. And so, as most people know, the prophets are divided between the major and the minor prophets. That is purely a librarian's term. There is no difference between Malachi and Isaiah and Daniel. They are equally important. They were equally given God's revelation. It purely is the fact that this takes up more space on a bookshelf. It's the larger books are considered the major prophets, including Daniel, and the minor prophets are some of the shorter texts. So, and Daniel's right in the midst of that. So, before we get started, I had two things that are off topic that I wanted to kind of cover. The first is, I don't know if any of you subscribe to the newspaper, but if you do, you will notice we are not raptured. And it was not in the news this morning that all of us are missing, which I'm really glad to see all of you here, so it wasn't just me. Nobody's more disappointed than I am, other than maybe that South African pastor who had a revelation from God that it was going to happen over Rosh Hashanah. He's probably pretty disappointed today. But that means we got another 7 years. Not sure what he's waiting for, but apparently he is. So thought that was big news. And then I think we could just dive in. I want to spend an entire class, as we usually do, without even opening the book, without even getting into the book of Daniel, and just talk about what are the things we need to know in order to study this effectively. But even taking a step further back, why study the prophets at all, right? Everything, for the most part, everything they've prophesied has already come to pass. You're not waiting for the fulfillment of most of these prophecies, especially Daniel has some apocalyptic prophecies, but a very small portion, and those might be of interest to you, but you could do a real simple study and figure out what's going to happen in the future. It kind of begs the question, well, this is history. This is things that have already come to pass, so why do we study it? Why is it held on the same level as going through Romans? Why do we still need to do a verse-by-verse study on this when we just acknowledge we're not going to learn theology? Why, and I think there's several levels to it. One is just developing a respect for the Word. If you can't prove that the Word of God is inspired, that this is the infallible Word of God, other than through things that are supernaturally confirmed, right? What else can you point to say this is from outside of our time and space domain. This is supernatural. This is inspired, other than prophecy. Jesus performed miracles, and you might be able to you could put your faith in that and say, well, the Bible's inspired because there are recorded miracles, and nobody's disputed those. I'll give you that. But more accurately, the Bible predicted things years and years in advance, and we're going to see some absolutely incredible ones in Daniel alone that there is no possible way that you could explain, aside from the fact that this was written by the Holy Spirit outside of our time and space domain. He foretold in advance things that were going to come to pass so that we would know this is inspired. There is no other way around it. And it's been the reason Daniel's very heavily criticized, because some of his predictions are so incredibly accurate that the only way it can be attacked is to say, well, this was a forgery. This was clearly a forgery. This was written after the fact. And no book in the Bible is more criticized than Daniel. I can tell you that. But if you're reading it for confirmation of your faith, you can justify your faith just in there is no other way than the God of the universe laid down something in advance. There is no other way anyone could have laid it out with this accuracy. And Daniel is the prime example of that. The other one is building trust. The things that are going to be in Daniel, and including these prophecies, are sensational, right? There are things that if they were in a normal text, you would not believe it was true. This would be like, these are fables. And that's the reason it's so heavily criticized. Some of it's like, this is absurd. Daniel was not even of the Babylonians, and he rose to be second in control of the Babylonian Empire. And when it collapsed, he rose to be second in command of the Persian Empire that succeeded. And the story of how that happened as a Jewish captive is sensational. It's weird. It's not like normal things that have happened. And along the way, he did it by use of supernatural divining dreams, surviving a fiery furnace, or, the Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego survived the fiery furnace. He's thrown in lions. These are things that are sensational, and you wouldn't believe them but for these authenticating factors like telling what's going to happen in the future, and then, by gosh, it comes true. And so just like Jesus said when the man was lowered through the roof, he says, your sins are forgiven. And so that what's harder for me to do? To say your sins are forgiven, or to heal and say, take up your bed and walk? And so you'll know that I have the power to forgive sins. I say, take up your bed and walk, right? The things that are spiritual are confirmed by evidence. He's saying, what's harder for me to do? To just say it? The same way here. There are some radical things that are being espoused, and some absurd things. They're authenticated by the fact that there are predictions that actually came true, and there's no way you can refute. There is truth behind it. And so if you can get into believing that these things are true and authenticated, then when you hear something that's even more absurd, that should cause you to go, this is craziness. These people are lunatics. Like, I don't know, say God became a man, dwelt among us, and then died in order to save us from a standard of sin that we could never hope to achieve. That is ludicrous. You are insane if you believe that. Unless there's a whole series of other crazy things that have been proven to be absolutely true, right? You have to establish this trust by, okay, it's intentionally a little bit out there. It's intentionally sensational, but then verified that this is truth, so that when you hear something like that, there is already truth established. You already have a foundation to build that on. If not for that foundation, if not for that thousands of years of just wild things happening and God verifying that he is who he says he is, then when he says, this is my son, you have no basis to believe him. So you're establishing a foundation for your trust that these things are true. The other one is just sheer reverence for God. To see God manipulate nations, to see him move people in and out of empires, to see him using world empires to establish things that he prophesied hundreds of years in advance. saying that the nation of Israel will have a period of servitude of 70 years, and saying how it will come to pass, and then using the king of Babylon to institute a period of servitude that is exactly 70 years, and then having the king of another subsequent world empire, the Persians, end that period of servitude by giving them incentives to go out and restore and rebuild Jerusalem in the year in which it was predicted. How do you not look at God and say, you are playing a chess game here? That nations and empires are moved around like pawns on your board. It was written 400 years in advance that I will give you a 70 years of servitude, and he used two different world empires, one to put them into servitude and another to release them on the 70-year mark. Tell me that's not incredible. Tell me that doesn't make you go, how great is God? These aren't even Christian empire. These aren't even Jewish empire. They don't even know God. He causes one of the most despotic, one of the most powerful rulers in the history of humanity to write a chapter on the Bible saying that's now in the Bible declaring the greatness and sovereignty of God. That is unbelievable. And this is not someone who was contested. This isn't someone who, well, we don't really know that he was who. Nebuchadnezzar, every historian will agree, he was the ruler of Babylon who built this thing, and he writes personally a chapter in the Bible, and in the records, in secular records, he has confirmed that he wrote that passage. That is a powerful God. And so just going through this detail by detail should cause you every week to go, wow, like how big is our God? We don't see him moving on that level on a daily basis, but he still is. And you're not getting out of this without the obvious one. The reason we do this is to know him, right? We're not deviating from that in the slightest, even though we're going back now 600 years before Christ. We're studying a book, events that occurred 600 years before Christ, so that we, 2,500 years later, can know him better. And that's a bizarre concept, and it's worth, as we go through every week, and we will continue to do this, reiterating, yes, this is entertaining. These are crazy stories. It's really cool to see it come to pass, but what are we trying to do? Every single week, what are we trying to do? Hebrews 10 says, Paul says, when he came into the world, he said, sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you have prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin you had no pleasure. Then I said, behold, I have come, in the volume of the book it is written of me. I come to do your will, O God. The volume of the book is written of me. That means everything Daniel wrote, Christ is laying claim to, right? He is saying all of this. And remember, when he says the volume of the book, is he talking about the New Testament? It hasn't even been written yet. He's talking about the Tanakh, the Torah. Every piece of it, every prophecy, every story is of him. And guess where Paul's quoting from? He's quoting from Psalm 40. That's a prophetic psalm. David is prophesying that this will be Jesus' statement. This is something Jesus will lay claim to. It is completely, when you talk about an integrated message system, it's even self-validating. The New Testament testifies that the Old is true, and the Old testifies of the New. It's a symbiotic system that requires both aspects. But even more, 1 Peter 1 says, this is Peter. We just went through John, and John focuses a lot on Peter's life. Peter was one of the three, the inner circle of Christ, was there on the Mount of Transfiguration with Christ, was there when the Spirit came down on him at his baptism and said, this is my Son in whom I am well pleased. He was there through every aspect. He saw the resurrected Christ. He talked and walked with Christ. Okay, and this is Peter's testimony. For we have not followed cunningly devised fables, when we made known unto you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. For he received from God the honor, from God the Father, honor and glory, when there came such a voice to him from the excellent glory, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. And this voice came from heaven, we heard, when we were with him in the holy mountain. So he's pointing to two different events. We saw the voice of God on the holy mountain, the Mount of Transfiguration. He said we were there when God personally testified that that was his son. And then he goes on to say, but we have also a more sure word of prophecy. This man walked and talked with Jesus. This man was there to see his resurrection, and he points to prophecy. He points to what we're studying now and says, we have a more sure word of prophecy. Whereunto you, us, do well that ye take heed, as unto a light that shineth in a dark place, until the day dawn and the day star arise in your hearts. Prophecy is what is going to confirm your faith. Prophecy is what makes Christ who he says he is. Without those prophecies, without telling hundreds and thousands of years in advance who he is and what he would do, he has nothing. There is nothing to point to and say absolute. We can confirm this is who was foretold, and so there is incredible value in that. And I've had this quote up a couple different times, but J.I. Packer, a book, Knowing God, is an excellent book, but we're in Daniel. That's incredibly entertaining. There's some super cool stories, great history behind it. But he says, whatever else in the Bible catches your eye, the crazy stories, whatever catches your eye, do not let it distract you from him. And that's going to be our purpose as we go through this. Don't get distracted by the incredible things in the life of this man and the stories he's telling and the prediction of prophecy. It's all about Christ. It will continue to be about him, and we will find him in every single story, page, prophecy, and that's going to be our focus. In order to get into these books, this is going to seem kind of dry and bland to a lot of you. Maybe everyone, I don't know. It's interesting to me, but I think you can't fully understand what Daniel's talking about unless you understand the setting in which this is occurring. Unless you understand who he's talking to, what brought this about. A lot of this becomes kind of jumbled and almost nonsense unless you understand when he's writing. The prophecies that he lays out about he lays out a prophecy about the goat, the leopard, and the bear, which will go and conquer, and it doesn't explain it. If you didn't know the historical context in which he's writing, you wouldn't know that it's written right in advance of the conquering of certain empires that happen to resemble exactly the attributes of the four beasts that he says. It lays out, because it happened at this time and this was going on. That prophecy lays out the Gentile history of world-dominating empires in successive order and describes the way in which they would conquer. But if you don't know when that happened, it has no significance, because you can't say, okay, well, that was before this. And so there's Arthur W. Pink actually has an entire commentary book, and this is just the index for it, on why study history before getting into the Bible. I won't go through all of these, but really there is infinite value in understanding the context. It doesn't take away the spiritual aspect of it or the inspired aspect, but it does really help with your interpretation and understanding of what's going on. And I say that to sort of justify why I'm going to spend 30 minutes going through the history and the setup, and why that matters, but also just to encourage you to do that on your own. Really make sure you understand when the Bible talks about Esther is in the Persian Empire and talking to the Persian king. Where does that fit in all of this? And why is it important that happened when it happened? And is that before this and before that? I think that matters. It's not as trivial. Okay, so focusing in on Daniel himself, Daniel is highly criticized. You will find so much written on the various reasons in which it can't be authentic, in which it was a forgery, in which it was written after the fact. And most of the critique doesn't go much deeper than just to say there's no way this could have happened when it said it happened. It, is far too sensational. There's no record of a man rising to be an assistant to Nebuchadnezzar and Well, that one's not true. There is tons of records to that one. But then subsequently rising to the Persian Empire, actually there's records on that one too. But the critiques don't stop. They still just say, well, that's absurd. It couldn't have happened, even though secular records will support it. And then the next level of it is just that it's really, really, really specific in its prophecies. So much so that every way you can attack it and say, well, this somehow wasn't the inspired word of God is latched onto, because otherwise you kind of have to wrestle with the fact that, crap, this thing does say very specifically a lot of things that are going to happen, and it forces you to acknowledge something bigger is going on here. And so if you're an opponent of the Bible, Daniel's one of those books that it's like you kind of have to find a way to get rid of in order to get rid of some of the more important ones, if that makes sense. Like some of the things that really challenge your theology, you kind of have to get rid of Daniel because it says makes some sensational predictions, and they all come true in really specific ways. And so there is just a ton of criticism out there, but there's also just a ton of archaeological evidence and support for the things that he said. And we'll go through that as we go. Who was Daniel? We don't know very much about him personally because he spent his entire life in captivity. And also, if you've noticed, the Bible doesn't ever really make a point about talking about who the prophets are personally, right? They don't have much identity beyond their calling and their role. Very few of the prophets even say anything beyond just where they're from. And I think that's very intentional, so that we see them as a vessel of God, an instrument of God, and not necessarily an individual. Daniel might be the one that we know most about just because his ministry starts when he's we'll call it his work, starts when he's probably 16 or 17 and continues, documented till his death when he was in his mid to late 80s. So of all of them, we probably know the most, but we don't know much. What we do know is he was of the royal line. He wasn't just anybody. It says that there were those of the house of the king's lineage that were taken into captivity. It also says he's handsome, which is weird. It says Nebuchadnezzar only took those which were comely to look upon. So they're good-looking people. The book spans the entire period of this captivity, from when the Jews went into captivity first to their release. That whole 70-year period is covered by the book of Daniel. Daniel was an administrator. He wasn't considered by the Jews in the Torah, or in the Tanakh, I should say. Daniel is not listed among the books of the prophets because he wasn't called as a prophet. There was an office within the church, within within Judaism. There is an office that one holds that he was a prophet, and Daniel never held that office because there was no temple during his life. There was no Judaism during his life. There were no sacrifices. There was no one holding. So in the Tanakh, he's kept separate from the prophets, even though they acknowledge the things that he said and the things that he did were prophetic. He's classified like David. David was a king, and yet they openly acknowledge that he was also prophetic utterances. But David never held the office of a prophet, and so Daniel's another one of them that's an oddity. Daniel is one of the most revered books in the text, like not from our standpoint, but he's quoted 3 times in Ezekiel. In the New Testament, there's at least 5 direct quotations of Daniel and over 200 allusions to the book of Daniel in the New Testament alone. Ezekiel sets Daniel up as a standard by which all can measure wisdom. And then, weirdly, he is one of only 2 figures that are featured in the Bible of which no evil is said. The only other one is Joseph. Joseph, and both are administrators that you can draw incredible parallels to the life of Joseph and the life of Daniel. Both are taken into captivity in a foreign land. Both rise to be second in command and serve God's will under a foreign empire. And weirdly, they are the only 2 of which nothing bad is said. And they both become types of Christ in weird ways. They both have strong typological resemblance to Christ, and we'll go through that. But most importantly, and the beginning and end of all of my scholastic research on authenticating the book of Daniel, is that Jesus quotes Daniel directly on 3 different occasions and also refers to him as Daniel the prophet. I don't need to go any further to ask, was Daniel a real person? Did Daniel really say the things he said he did? Did Daniel really write the book of Daniel? Jesus said he did. If you don't believe Jesus, you have bigger problems than who wrote the book of Daniel. And you don't need to get into any of the scholastic research that divides this into 4 parts that were written in 4 different sections because of the segmentation. There's 2 different languages that are used in the drafting, and that seems to be a method. Just push it all away. Daniel wrote Daniel because Jesus said, and if you're not going to take Jesus at his word, then just put it all away and go do something else. So that's my theory on all of it. I don't really get into the debates. From understanding the bigger picture, this is the chart that we always use that show really the nearly 5,000 years, or 4,000 years, I should say, of human history from creation to Christ. And you'll notice that the book of Daniel happens after there's the prehistoric period prior to the flood. The flood leads to the patriarchs. The chronology of the patriarchs is covered in Genesis, and Genesis pretty much ends near the captivity in Egypt, and the rest of the Torah spans the Jews coming out of Egypt, establishing the law, the wilderness wanderings, and then that leads to what we refer to, once they're in the land, once they have conquered, Joshua brings them into the land. There's this period that we refer to as the period of the judges, where there's no king in Israel, but they're in the land, and it's a period of great wickedness. That's chronicled in Judges. Ruth takes place, Chronicles, and then we have the period of the monarchy. First Saul, the people wanted a king before God was ready to give them a king. He demands a king, and so they said, fine, you want a king, you can have one. And he gives them Saul, who's kind of a disaster, but then when God's king comes in, he establishes the monarchy. And the monarchy continues right up until the point we're at now. But the monarchy is divided into David and Solomon's reign, and then Solomon's sons start to fall apart. They become progressively more and more and more and more wicked. And the first of them immediately raises taxes in a way that was so incredibly punitive that it causes the people to rebel. And there is a rebellion, and Israel, the nation, is divided into the northern and the southern kingdom. And from then on, we're going to hear of this period, the divided kingdom, that talks about, in the northern kingdom, certain prophets were prophets to the northern kingdom, like Jonah, Amos, Hosea were prophets in the northern kingdom. And then the northern kingdom falls. The southern kingdom was survived much longer, and we'll talk about that in a little while. And the southern kingdom is what lives up to the point of the book of Daniel. The southern kingdom is often referred to as Judah. It continues the way it was divided. The northern kingdom went into idolatry, and those who wanted to get away from the worship of God went into the northern kingdom, where it was legal to get into idolatry. Those who wanted to continue to be faithful went into the southern kingdom, where Jerusalem was and the temple, and they continued to worship there. Anything you hear about the 10 lost tribes or whatever is nonsense. They were not divided by tribe at that point. It was by those who were faithful and those who weren't. The southern kingdom continues, and that gets us to the point we are now. The northern kingdom was wiped out entirely, and the Bible says never to be brought back into remembrance. You will never hear of the northern kingdom again. It had gotten so wicked that God promised that it would be wiped out and would never be restored. He told the southern kingdom through Jeremiah that you have a period of judgment coming, right? 70 years were determined upon Judah, the southern kingdom, and then he also promised that he would bring them back into the land. God takes his commands very seriously. There is part of the Sabbath process. There's a Sabbath in the weeks. There's every seventh day you're supposed to rest. There was a Sabbath of years, and for this whole period that they had been in the nation, that they had been in the land, they had not observed that Sabbath of years. They hadn't allowed the land to rest every 70 years, and so God says, you owe me 70. After 70 years of ignoring that Sabbath, he says, you owe me 70, and prophesied that they would be taken out of the land, which starts a period that's called the desolate, or the servitude of the nation. And he says, 70 years, you're out. You will be taken into captivity, and that's what brings about the events that we're going to see. And that becomes a fundamental part of what happens here. After Daniel, after this period where they were taken out of the land, in Ezra and Nehemiah, we see the king of Persia giving permission for the Jews to come back into Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, rebuild the city, and that ends this desolation of the nation. And that's what's covered in the book of Nehemiah, Ezra, and Joel, and several of the minor prophets are during that period. And then we've got this period of about 400 years that's between the last of the Old Testament and the New Testament that most people refer to as the silent years. I forgot to be clicking here. The captivity is when Daniel takes place. The silent years are this 400-year period between the testaments that we call the silent years, only out of ignorance. There is nothing silent about them. Daniel is going to detail events that take place during this 400-year period with incredible precision, including the rise of Alexander the Great, his conquest, that he would die young, that his empire would be divided among his 4 generals. All of it is detailed in chapters 10 and 11 of Daniel, so much so that people attack this as being false. For our purpose, one of the things to note was the Vorlage, which was the Jews had all the various writings, right? They were writings that they considered sacred, but they weren't compiled into a book that was their sacred text until Ezra and Nehemiah reestablished the temple. And Ezra, one of the things he does is compile the Tanakh, like takes all these writings that have happened before, including some of the older prophets like Isaiah, and compiles them into what is Scripture. And that becomes the Vorlage, which is the basis for all of our texts. It's a Hebrew text written very shortly, like within a 70 to 80 years after Daniel. And it includes Daniel, right? So we know that this book was included in a text that was compiled less than 100 years after the life of Daniel. That's a pretty decent authenticating factor that this was legit, that this was written when it says it was written because it was included in that compilation. But even more powerful is during this period, the silent years in 285, the Septuagint was put together. Septuagint was a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. The world spoke Greek. Alexander the Great had taken over the world and enforced everyone spoke Greek, and they wanted the Bible in their language, in their native language. Jews still spoke Hebrew, like a Catholic priest speaks Latin, just as a liturgical thing, but they wanted a translation. So they spent, I think it's 8 years translating the Vorlage into Greek, which is the most precise language, and it includes all of Daniel. So 285, Daniel is translated into Greek, and we still use that same text today, and it's the Septuagint that most of the New Testament authors are quoting from. So there is no possible basis for saying this was written any time other than when it claims to be written. It was authenticated and then re-authenticated. And we can have tremendous confidence that these incredible things that were predicted in advance were predicted when they say they are, and they came to pass in fulfillment of prophecy. It puts any argument of timing, it makes them absolutely absurd. We can find copies of the fully compiled Septuagint today. So from a historical standpoint, that's where it lands in the timeline of all this. And Daniel is going to be someone who helps shape all of the world empires in the weirdest way. So much so that's part of what people think is absurd. So anyone who's tried to study this, anyone who's tried to get into the prophets, tried to get into even New Testament, you hear a ton about, during the Assyrian conquest and the Babylonians did this and the Egyptians did that. You don't have to understand every intricacy of world history to really get a sense of what's going on. But just from a super high level, there is this place, Jerusalem and Israel, is located in the strangest place imaginable. It is a crossroad to every world empire that has come to power. If the ones that rose to go north, the ones that conquered south, everything had to pass through Israel. And so it became this like battleground buffer state for nearly every world empire that we saw come to power. That's just a rough outline of where it sits and its significance. The oldest world empire, we see a ton about Egypt. Egypt was never conquered outside of Egypt, but it was the domineering factor in most of the Old Testament. For about nearly 2,000 years, Egypt was the predominant power, and they maintained that for so long because they didn't try to expand. They weren't out trying to conquer. They kept sovereign, and they were the world dominating factor for a very long time, right up until the period of the book of Daniel. From the period of the Exodus all the way through Daniel, Egypt was still the force to be reckoned with. And you constantly see them throughout the Bible, even through the Judges, through David's, battling with Egypt. Every aspect kind of flows through Egypt. This is kind of the end of it. Egypt covers only about that portion. And then the next one you start hearing in Jonah about Nineveh. Jonah was sent to Nineveh and it was a wicked place. Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire was brutal in their conquest. They dominated the world through like terrorism. I mean, the stories of how they destroyed nations and led people captive was horrifying. And that's the reason Jonah hated them so much and the Jews hated them so much, is the stories of how they had been how they had taken over world dominance, including, very recently when Jonah wrote the book, the Northern Kingdom. Assyria rose to prominence, and in their conquest, they were the ones that destroyed the Northern Kingdom, and they didn't take people captive, they wiped out. They had a scorched earth policy. They maybe took some slaves, but there was no existence, and that's the reason the Bible can say that the Northern Kingdom will be judged and never again taken into remembrance, because they were utterly demolished by the Assyrians. The Assyrian Empire lasted 200 to 300 years. It was fair. No, not quite that long. In power, probably 150 years. And one of the city-states within the Assyrian Empire was a little place called Babylon. And it was prominent, but not the capital, not a major city center. It wasn't a world headquarter. But during the Assyrians' reign, it starts to rise, and a guy named Nabopolassar, Evil-Merodach is the first. He was the first king of Babylon. He rebels against the Assyrian Empire, and then his son Nabopolassar takes it seriously and goes to war with the Assyrian Empire. And Babylon not only throws off the Assyrian Empire, they continue to expand further and conquer. And under young general, son of Nabopolassar, is Nebuchadnezzar. He was a famous general long before he was a king, and he is responsible for most of Babylon's conquest of what was the civilized world. You'll hear a lot about Mesopotamia. That literally just means the land between two rivers. It means between two rivers, and that's that strip between the Tigris and the Euphrates. So anytime you hear him talk about Mesopotamia, and then we'll hear a ton in Daniel about the Chaldeans, of Ur of the Chaldeans. If that area, Mesopotamia, is the country, then Chaldea and Chaldea is the county. It's just more like a local reference to the area around Babylon. So Babylon dominates, and they also conquer. They take captive. They're not nearly as brutal as the Assyrians. And that empire lasts a very short time, relatively, about 70, 80 years in their peak. And the book of Daniel covers that entire period. They were followed by the Persian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire. A guy named Cyrus was the king of the overarchy. He was treated as a god of the Persian Empire. Creates an alliance between the Medes and the Persians. And so that's the northern tribes and the tribes that are now in what's India, allies them together and overthrows everything, conquers everywhere. But Cyrus is very, what we would call, progressive. He conquers and relocates people. He grabs people from different areas and sends them other areas. He doesn't have wholesale slaughter. He sends them to other areas and just integrates cultures. So he'll send 1,000 from here, 1,000 from there, 1,000, and move them somewhere random so that they're just Persian. So he's created this network of people. His empire keeps growing. He doesn't kill everyone, and so it keeps getting smaller. He actually grows by allowing people to live, and that's going to be important in ours. And he's famous for taking over so much of the known world without even fighting, and we're going to see that in the book of Daniel. We're going to see his conquest of Babylon occurs in one night without even a battle. In fact, some of the inhabitants of Babylon didn't even realize they'd been conquered until 5 days later. And that's the way he comes to power. After him comes Alexander the Great, who at 26 years old falls asleep in his bed crying that there are no more known worlds to conquer. In about 13 years, he conquers the civilized world in a series of some of the most incredible and fastest campaigns you could ever imagine. His empire expands all the way into Asia, which really isn't even civilized, established at this time, up into Europe, but it affects biblical history, and that is that whole period of the silent years, is the Greek Empire's reign. You'll notice that everything's in Greek. By the time Jesus comes around, they're still using Greek texts. The Romans came shortly before the time of Christ and defeated the Greeks, and they obviously expanded theirs. And most everyone that's gone through school knows a lot about the Roman Empire, very little about the rest. But that's when we see the time of Christ is during the early years of the Roman Empire. What's really important for our purpose, the Roman Empire was never conquered. The Roman Empire just slowly atrophied over the years. Their social policy, they moved, Constantine takes the capital from Rome to Constantinople, and it becomes sort of the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western, but none of it's ever conquered. It sort of just fades into what we see today, into different arms and legs of the Roman Empire. It never falls. And that's going to be really important when we get into the later chapters that talk about the fall of Babylon and that talk about can't get ahead of myself there. So incredible precision, but it matters that Rome was never conquered. It is fundamental to the text that it atrophied over time. Daniel itself is a really incredible story. So much so that we have to actually feel the need to justify ourselves. This battle of it's called Battle of Carchemish, is when Nebuchadnezzar finally, this is what builds his name. He treks from Babylon over to Egypt and makes war with the Egyptian Empire and wins. That had yet to be done. The Persian Empire, the Assyrian Empire that came before him, never came against Egypt. Egypt was the known power forever. Nebuchadnezzar makes his way from where we saw him between the Tigris and the Euphrates into Egypt and beats Egypt in what's known as the Battle of Carchemish, which is this starts the decline of Egypt and the rise of Babylon. The thing you have to pass through to get to Egypt from Babylon is a place called Israel. On his way after defeating Egypt, he stops and just out of convenience lays siege and conquers Israel. That conquest was the first siege of Israel, and he goes in, takes tribute, takes many of the implements from the temple, and subjugates the king, and tells them, "You can continue as a vassal state of Babylon, but you are now Babylonian." And that starts the period that's called the servitude of the nations. From the point when Nebuchadnezzar takes over and conquers Israel is referred to as the servitude of the nation. It was prophesied in 2 Chronicles 36 with incredible specificity. But Israel, having been sort of left alone, they're under Babylonian rule, as Israel is wont to do, rebels a second time. The prophets in Israel are telling the king, don't rebel. Nebuchadnezzar is an instrument of God. Don't rebel. The king doesn't listen and gets on a pride trip and rebels against Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar has to come back, and at that point he kills Jehoiakim, which is the king of Israel at that point, and puts in place allows them to keep their government, but they lay siege and keep it subjugated. It was a pretty pretty brutal sack of Jerusalem. And at the end of it, he takes Jehoiakim's son, who is now presumptively the king, takes him into captivity, right? Takes him, captures him, takes him into captivity. What's interesting is, and this is really how specific prophecy starts getting in this area, there are two prophets prophesying at the time. There's Jeremiah and there's Ezekiel that are both prophesying about this, and they're warning Jehoiakim not to rebel, and they don't rebel. Nebuchadnezzar's the hand of God. One of them says, "You will go into Babylon and not see it," or one of them says that you will not see Babylon, and then another one says you'll be taken to Babylon and killed. And it's recorded that they mocked the prophets because they couldn't get their story straight. One says you'll be taken to Babylon, and one says you won't see Babylon. One says you'll be taken there and killed. Well, it turns out 200 years after these are written, Jehoiakim Nebuchadnezzar takes his sons before him, and while his sons are before him, he puts out his eyes and then kills his sons and takes him to Babylon, and there he sits on trial for 3 years and is killed. So with absolute precision, he did not see Babylon, and yet he was taken to Babylon and killed. And yet that was one of the reasons they mocked the prophets and said, you guys can't even get your story straight, and convinced Zedekiah for the second time to rebel. Yet that is insane level of precision. Even when they seemed to contradict, it was because it was so precise. So that continues in the second siege. Jeconiah is taken as a captive, which leaves Zedekiah as a vassal king in Israel. The people sort of reject Jeconiah because he's like a puppet of Babylon and start treating Zedekiah as the king. It's when Jeconiah is taken captured, it says 11,000 were taken captive with him, and this is what it includes those. Daniel was part of that captivity along with Hananiah, Mishael, and Tubal, which Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are part of this captivity that goes into Babylon because that's kind of what they did. They were assimilating cultures and they wanted the best of everything. Nebuchadnezzar was obsessed with the best statues, the best buildings, and they took the best of what they thought the people were, the best looking, the wisest, and would bring them in and make them part of this, of what is the city of Babylon. They became inhabitants of that city because they were the best and the brightest. So after Jeconiah is taken captive, again, the false prophets convinced Zedekiah to rebel against Nebuchadnezzar. And finally, he's done. He's tired of laying sack to the city and it rebelling. He's been generous and merciful. And he comes in and utterly destroys Jerusalem, lays waste to the city, destroys the temple. It just absolutely annihilates the people in a horrific slaughter, and doesn't take captives. And that starts this period that is known as the desolation of the nation. Those are two different things. The servitude of the nation and the desolation of the nation, two different 70-year time periods, both of which are predicted in advance and both of which are fulfilled in exactly on a 70-year time frame. If you confuse the two, you start messing up the timeline. But know that the city, the nation, wasn't destroyed. There was no desolation during the first or even the first 3 sieges. He never destroys it. The city is destroyed at the end of his last siege when he kills Zedekiah, and that starts the 70-year period called the desolation of the nation. And that's something we're going to see. We're going to see the fulfillment of these 70-year periods with some incredible precision. The interrupted prayer of Daniel, the 70 weeks of Daniel, where he prays and prophesies the day in which the Messiah would return, is because he's watching his calendar and he knows, 70 years is almost up. We're about to go back. And so he starts praying for the nation because he knows that was prophesied and it's going to happen. Let's see, what's next? Nebuchadnezzar dies in 562. It's well recorded in history. So this period between when Daniel was taken captive and when Nebuchadnezzar dies is when most of the book is written. He was a close advisor to Nebuchadnezzar. And then he seems to sort of go into retirement as the country, after Nebuchadnezzar, his kids all war together and fight for dominance. And really, it's just kind of a slaughterhouse at the in the monarchy of Babylon. But that period, it's a relatively short period, is when Daniel is an advisor to Nebuchadnezzar that we're going to read most about. The next thing after Nebuchadnezzar dies is the Persian conquest of Babylon. The Persians come in and conquer Babylon, and that happens. Everyone's heard the story, the handwriting on the wall, many, many tekel upharsin, where a hand shows up. Belteshazzar's throwing a party in Babylon, and a hand starts writing on the wall, and all of a sudden the party ends. That's the day in which, and it tells us that's the day in which the Persians conquered the city. Daniel tells Belteshazzar, it says, numbered, your days are numbered. God has found you wanting, and your days are numbered. And that very night, the city is conquered, and Belteshazzar's killed, and the Persians take over the Babylonian Empire. The writing on the wall is recorded in Daniel. What's not recorded in Daniel is the interaction between Daniel and Cyrus the Conqueror, the king of the Persians. And this is written in Josephus, and 2 other historians record this event. It's not in the Bible, but people accept that it is history. It was written by many of the respected historians. When Cyrus shows up 5 days after the conquest of Babylon, the king shows up. It was Nibiru, his general, who conquered Babylon, but the king shows up 5 days later, and there is an old man standing there with a 300-year-old copy of the scroll of Isaiah that has in it, he shows it to the king, that says, I have forenamed you Cyrus. I have called you Cyrus. I have made you my conqueror, my right hand, to lay waste to nations. And I'm just going to even... one of the things that the Bible says about Belteshazzar when he sees the handwriting on the wall is that his knees smote one against another and his loins loosed. Right? That doesn't really come through in the King James. His knees were knocking and he defecated himself. Right? That's what loins loosed. It becomes such a famous thing that was what they mocked him for. And even in Isaiah it says, it is I have named you Cyrus. I have made you my conqueror. By my hand you will conquer. You will overthrow without a battle. You will loose the loins of kings. And by your hand I will set my people free. Right? Imagine being Cyrus and someone stands there with a scroll with your name on it that describes how you conquered the city and the thing everyone's mocking the king for. And it says, by my hand, you will set my people free. Go figure, the first thing Cyrus does is sets the Jews free. The only country that he does this for, he not only allows them to go rebuild Jerusalem, which is what we see in Nehemiah, he gives them incentives. He pays them to leave and go rebuild their temple. He is so impressed with what he saw. That is incredible, profound, and the Jews continue to try to rebuild all the way through until the period of Nehemiah gets the final authorization to build defensive structures, and that happens about 40 years later. So that period right after the conquest, you wonder, why did Daniel rise to prominence in the Persian Empire in no time at all? Because he was standing there and presented a scroll to the king saying, this has been prophesied, and immediately he gains a position of prominence, and he becomes an advisor, just like you would if someone presented a prophecy of you conquering. They make him an advisor to the administrator of that area, which is Darius. Darius is not the king of Persia. He is the king of this area. So when we see Daniel in the lion's den, he goes to King Darius. Many people are confused. That's like the regional ruler. Cyrus is still the ruler over all of Persia, but Daniel becomes second to Darius, and immediately he's an advisor to the king. And that's when we see they appoint him to this role. The current advisors are jealous, and we see this lion's den scenario, right? But you can see it's not crazy how this person became an advisor to a second world empire. It's prophetic. I mean, it makes sense. It's not just, fanciful. Daniel dies in about 535. The formal rebuilding of the temple happens in 517, which by sheer coincidence is exactly 70 years after Nebuchadnezzar lays waste to the city, creating the desolation of the nation. So you've got the fulfillment of the servitude of the nation in Cyrus's decree, and then you've got the fulfillment of the desolation of the nation in the subsequent rebuilding of the temple. And they are incredibly precise. The book of Daniel itself causes some difficulty in studying it because there's a few different factors, but there's two sections. Going into it, you have to anticipate and appreciate that there are two sections to the book. The first 6 chapters are historical. It's a narrative of what happens in the life of Daniel. In that, we'll see the first story is them being deported as a teenager and him coming into the empire. Chapter 2 is Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the statue of the various metals that Daniel interprets, which makes him prominent in the empire. And then it's interesting that one of the criticisms is that from chapter 2 to chapter 7, it's written in a different language. It's written in Aramaic. Well, go figure. He writes it in the language of the nation in which he is a subject, and he doesn't write in the Hebrew. He switches languages, and that becomes a criticism of it. But everything in chapter 2 through chapter 7 is Gentile focused. All the prophecies are about the things that are going to happen out. They don't have anything to do with Jerusalem. They are things that are going to happen during Alexander the Great's conquest. They are not Israel focused, and he uses the language of the people because they're prophecies about what's going to happen to the rest of the world. So I didn't finish that. So chapter 3 is the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the fiery furnace. Chapter 4 is Nebuchadnezzar's personal testimony after he's filled with pride and was sent into madness. He then writes an edict that goes out to the known world declaring that Daniel's God is the God of the universe. Chapter 5 chronicles the fall of Babylon, which is the writing on the wall and the conquest. Chapter 6 is then Daniel in the lion's den, which happens during his time in the Persian Empire. Then you kind of go back. You have to realize we reset. And chapter 7 through 12 go through Daniel's various visions. And it's not necessarily in chronological order. It's topical. He tells the history, and then he goes back and tells his visions. And they're not necessarily happening at one time. So you've got the vision of the 4 beasts, which profiles all of Gentile history, the ram and the he-goat prophecy, which is Alexander the Great's conquest. And now, once again, he shifts back to Hebrew. The rest of the book is written in Hebrew because it's going to deal with Israel. And chapter 9 is the 70 weeks of Daniel, the interrupted prayer. Chapter 10 gives a glimpse of the dark side and the spiritual. This is where we hear of the prince of the powers of Persia warring against the prince of the powers of Greece. And that's a really fascinating chapter. Chapter 11 details events that are going to happen during those silent years, the fall of Greece, the division into 4 different kingdoms, Lysimachus taking one area and warring against Ptolemy, in insane detail, lays that out. And then chapter 10 is the consummation of all things. It's his final prophecy. It's the apocalyptic prophecy. And so we will move through them. I was tempted to kind of try to throw the visions in and try to do it in chronological order. But I think it is kind of important to study the historical part of it one way and then switch our focus once we get to chapter 7. I think that's probably why it's structured that way. And say, okay, now we're dealing and interpreting visions, and this is going to be a lot more reading between the lines. So we'll move a lot faster, too. We can do chapter 1 and 2 together. They're relatively short, and that is where we'll start next week. And I'm clearly excited about studying Daniel. I think it's fascinating just because there's not a single chapter that doesn't have something that will cause you to go, wow, like every single chapter. There is no dead air where you're just like, okay, I'm not sure what we're supposed to be getting out of this. It will leave you with a reverence of God and the view that this is all so far beyond anything we could understand and part of a game that we couldn't even hope to appreciate. And somehow Daniel is at the center of it for this 100-year period that forms the world that we know it in the modern age. And so it's still continue to feel the effects of things that happen during this time. And so I really enjoy studying it. I promise it won't all be history like this. But I think I hope it's not a waste of your time. I think it's incredibly important to understand that these are warring empires. This period of about 300 years saw saw 4 of the 5 world empires that we would ever see. That concept of an empire conquering on a global scale didn't happen again. It ended with the Roman Empire, it's you can't imagine it today. It's no longer feasible, but it changed hands so fast and so many times that you won't understand most of the prophets, not to mention the book of Kings and even in Samuel, until you understand the world that happened subsequent to that. So
it seems like I remember the Nephilim hidden in there somewhere. Were they part of?
the last really mention of the Nephilim is during David's time. David and Goliath. Goliath was of the tribe of the Nephilim. His father was the king of the Ananiak, the Nephilim tribe. Joshua's conquest of the Promised Land, essentially when God commanded wipe out every man, woman, and child in that land, it wasn't because they were particularly evil or God was vengeful. It's because they had a gene pool problem. That the Nephilim had done the same thing that happened in Genesis 6. There was trying to thwart God's purpose by taking this area that God had promised that this would be where
were they just spirits then that escaped the flood and then came back after the flood?
Or fallen angels that continue to do the same. Nothing stops more of them from coming down and doing the same thing that happened before the flood. Like, the angels weren't wiped out in the flood. They could have come down and cohabitated again. But it's entirely possible. No speculation, but it does say in Genesis 6 that in those days and after those days that the sons of God came down and cohabitated with women. So it kind of forecasts that it continued to happen despite the flood. But you won't understand Joshua and the reason it's so brutal, that this conquest of this area is literally killing everything. And the times that they failed to kill every man, woman, and child, that horrible things happened, it's because that, again, there was a gene pool problem, that proliferation of these hybrids had started again in that area. So we really don't see much or any mention after the monarchy, after the time of David, and so we're quite a ways after that. But let me stop the recording here.
Oh, I'm sorry.